Hello and welcome to today's webinar, The Perl Paradox, brought to you by eMedia and ActiveState. I'm Karen Bannon and I'll be your moderator for today. We have just a few quick notes before we begin. Slides will advance automatically throughout our event. In addition, the console you're looking at is customizable. This means you can move and resize any of the windows you see open, as well as explore the widgets at the bottom of your screen. We'd like this event to be as interactive as possible, so at this time we invite you to ask any questions you may have by using that question box on the left side of your screen. We'll get to as many as we can towards the end of the event. And finally, an on-demand presentation will be available after the event. All attendees will receive a link via email within 24 hours. So Perl is one of those programming languages that people just take for granted, even as it keeps evolving and the functionality keeps getting better. ActiveState is in a unique position in the Perl world, both as the creator of the first ever Perl for Windows distribution and as a leading supplier of enterprise Perl solutions. While the rest of the world sees Perl as a legacy language and analysts insist that no one is talking about it, the Perl business at ActiveState is vibrant, alive, and growing. Leading companies such as Amazon, Boeing, and Cisco continue to demand Perl skills in their developers, while Booking.com is investing in Perl as its core development language. How can this be explained? In today's webinar, our expert will discuss Perl's origins, why enterprises rely on Perl, and why one of the most important technologies in the world is not keeping quiet anymore. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our expert, Tom Radcliffe. Tom has more than 20 years' experience in the software development and management in both academia and industry. He's a professional engineer and holds a PhD in physics from Queen's University at Kingston. Tom brings a passion for quantitative, data-driven processes to ActiveState. And with that, let's get started. Tom, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Karen. As you said, I'm a physicist by education, and spent most of the 90s in academia and jumped into software development during the dot-com boom. I am a lapsed Perl person, as many people are today. I did a lot of work in Perl in the early 2000s and have subsequently been an entrepreneur working mostly in C, C++ embedded systems with a lot of Python for algorithm development. And since coming back to ActiveState last year, I have been plunged back into the Perl world, which has changed a little bit since 2005 or so. In fact, it's changed a great deal, and it's been quite remarkable to look around at Perl and see where we are now and how the language has evolved and continued to be such a vibrant and important part of the software development landscape, even while nobody's talking about it. When I came back to ActiveState, I thought, well, I know they did Perl, but maybe Python is the future, or something else is the future. And it turns out that Perl has tremendous depth and presence in a variety of places that we just don't think about or talk about. So as you said, ActiveState has been shipping Perl on Windows since 1997. The company was founded around Perl on Windows, and we currently support Perl 5 from 5.8 to 5.24, most recently, on a wide range of operating systems, including Windows, Windows Server, Linux, OS X, and some of the older big iron machines that enterprises are still running. And it is one of the things I think we don't necessarily appreciate is how long both hardware and software live. We think of ourselves as living in an x86 dominated Windows and Linux and Mac world, but there is a significant amount of the world's infrastructure that is still dependent on AIX, HPUX, and especially Solaris because of Oracle's role in the Solaris universe. So with all those varieties out there, people need supported versions of Perl. They don't want to be running Perl 5.10 with the OpenSSL version that was current in 2005 or 2007. So we have customers who do get things like regular updates of 32-bit Perl on HPUX Titanium, running older versions. And this all runs quietly in the background without anyone thinking about it or talking about it. even granted that, I kind of assumed that, well, Perl is still a legacy language. It was the duct tape of the internet once upon a time. Now it's not so current anymore. And it turns out that I was completely wrong about that, in much the same way that in the late Middle Ages, people might have thought that classical learning was irrelevant, defunct, long past, no longer interesting. Who cares about those Greeks and Romans anyway? And then we got the Renaissance. And in much the same way, I believe that we are experiencing a renaissance in the Perl world as important features are being backported from Perl 6 and features are being absorbed from other languages into the Perl 5 universe, which makes it a tremendously powerful general purpose tool, which also happens to have hundreds of millions of lines, probably billions of lines, of mission critical code already running out in the enterprises around the world. So this is not at all what I was expecting. It's always interesting as a scientist when you go out and look at something and you have expectations and you think, oh, it'll probably be like this, but I'll check anyway. And when you find something that makes you go, hey, that's weird, that's the most exciting thing, because if the world just conformed to our expectations all the time, it would be boring and unsurprising. Whereas the Perl world has not at all conformed to my expectations, and I think a lot of people have expectations that are out of sync with reality. And part of what we're trying to do at ActiveState is spread the word about what is really happening in the Perl universe, and what has been happening for the last many years, as we'll see. So what I think of as a Perl paradox is the fact that literally no one talks about Perl. We can't get analysts to talk to us about Perl, and yet absolutely everybody depends on it in ways that we don't think about, we don't know about, and that we see at ActiveState, because we have enterprise customers who are coming to us saying, we have Perl 5.10 running all of these critical processes. How do we upgrade to Perl 5.24 or 5.22? We have Perl 5.8. How do we make sure that it's still secure? We have Perl 5.14. What do we do? What do we do next? How do we keep this great language that we've depended on for all these years, still make sure that it contributes to our enterprise and continues to run seamlessly and safely on all of this diverse hardware? And that's what we see from the inside, while from the outside there's silence. And we actually did talk to Gartner in particular. I guess I'll talk about Gartner momentarily. But when we talk to our customers, we do hear things like this. These are actual quotes from customers saying that it's not just that we have a lot of Perl that's been around forever and nobody touches it. It is that we're writing new Perl, that one of our vendors is switching to Perl, that our research people use it, that we have thousands of jobs running every day that are largely Perl, and at the same time, nobody outside of the people who are touching the code themselves ever talks about it. And so it's this very powerful tool which is, relatively speaking, invisible outside of the back room of the enterprise. And that's a sad state of affairs, because we believe that there are opportunities for Perl in the enterprise that are not being pursued necessarily, because people just aren't thinking of the language, because it's doing its job so well in its current state. This is the Gartner market. Yep.
Oh, I was actually going to say, you said that there are some places where people just aren't thinking of Perl. So where do you see the low-hanging fruit? So what would you suggest that people to start thinking about?
Well, I think new large IT projects, particularly dealing with big data, are an area where people seem to naturally be going to Python, for example, which is not necessarily a bad choice, but Perl does have some performance advantages overall. And for anything that deals with text processing, and this is one of the things that I've seen myself in coming back to Perl from Python, regular expressions, which are the core of the text processing engine in Perl, are handled in a module in Python, and it always feels to me like there's some friction in doing that whenever I need to do a regular expression to parse a string in Python, I have to think about a bunch of stuff. Whereas in Perl, regular expressions are an embedded part of the language. They're just there in the language. And a huge amount of work that one typically does in Perl scripting when processing text is built around regular expressions. And they are just powerful, fast, and easy to use. You have to be disciplined in the way that you use them, like any powerful tool. If you use a chainsaw in an undisciplined way, bad things will happen. That's not a problem with chainsaws. That's a problem with lack of discipline. With regular expressions, it's the same thing. You can use them badly. You can make them, write them in ways that are hard to understand and are difficult to change. But if you write them in a disciplined way and document them well, they're just an incredibly powerful tool. So any big data process dealing with text, especially, I think is a really low-hanging fruit case of Perl use in the enterprise.
Okay, sorry I interrupted, but I was curious you said that, so
my pleasure.
I'll let you get back. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, no, go ahead and interrupt. I have a lot of momentum. I tend to get going and charge ahead, so feel free to break in. So this is the Gartner Market Clock, which is their way of describing where languages are in the development process or in the utilization process. And the clock starts at the top for reasons I'm not clear on. The zenith is at the bottom. New languages start out in the sort of upper right-hand quadrant. They get standardized in the lower right. They move into industrialization in the lower left, and then they drift into obsolescence in the upper left. And Perl is deep into the industrialization phase. I have it on good authority, although we've not been able to find the graphic, that Gartner did declare Perl had moved into obsolescence some years ago, but then they pulled it back because it's simply not obsolete. It's a vibrant and alive language. I also find it a little peculiar that Fortran is listed as being obsolescent. I don't expect to ever fly in an aircraft that doesn't have some Fortran in the computational fluid dynamics code that was used to design it. It's a specialized language in certain respects, but what it does extraordinarily well and is unlikely to be replaced. I've also put on this graph something that I think just illustrates that how we think about high tech isn't necessarily universally correct. We tend to think of technologies as being created, growing, having a peak, and then dying off. And that has been true in general over the past 30 years of new programming languages, because it's been an extraordinarily fertile time in the history of computing, where a huge number of new languages have entered the market, have found niches, and then have become obsolete. But I don't think that is by any means a universal curve with regard to new technologies. And I think Fortran actually is another example, as well as Perl, of this. But I've put on this graph the fork, not the process fork in computing, but the fork as a table utensil, which is only about 300 years old. Prior to the early 1600s, at least in the English-speaking world, people ate with basically spoons and knives. Forks were kitchen implements. And the fork was an innovation in the early 1600s. It was debated. There were moral questions about the use of the fork, whether or not it was impious to use a fork because you weren't touching God's food with your hands. And forks eventually became universally adopted and haven't gone away. And I think there's an argument to be made for languages like Perl, languages like Fortran, that will continue to be part of our lives into the indefinite future. So I want to challenge the very concept of the Gartner market clock with regard to certain technologies. I think it's appropriate as a way of tracking things up to a point, but I really believe that there will be a significant number of technologies that simply get stuck in the transition between the lower left and the upper left and never cross that boundary because they solve problems extremely well and those problems are not going to go away. And I think there's a significant class of problems, particularly around large-scale text processing and scripting, that Perl does so well that it is unlikely to be displaced anytime soon. So that's a little bit of a preview of what I think is going on in the Perl world. But the question that we had ultimately, when we were looking at this at ActiveState, the question was, well, what is going on? How come all of our customers are using Perl? People are writing new code in Perl. People are starting new projects in Perl, and we can't get anybody outside of those small groups to talk about Perl. Why aren't more people using this? Why aren't more people aware of it? And it turns out, in fact, that they are. They just don't talk about it. So what we did was send out a survey of a bunch of questions to 18,000 people who had downloaded Active Perl in the last year and a half. That's about 2% of our overall downloaders, because we ask for an email address, but we have not, up until now, insisted on one. So we don't get email addresses from a lot of people, and a lot of the email addresses we do get aren't necessarily valid or useful. Of those 18,000, we got about 2% response rate, with enough industrial users and individual users that we could break those out separately and see what they were doing and see some differences between industrial and individual use. But it's important to emphasize that these are, we have a quarter of the sample there, third of the sample there, quarter of the sample, I guess, that is using Perl in a commercial industrial context. These are not hobbyists. They're people who are using Perl professionally. And we wanted to know where are you using Perl, what version are you using, what OS are you using it on, how long have you been using it for, what industry, and what are you doing, and why did you choose Perl in general and Active Perl in particular? And I think no, that's correct. Okay. So are we looking at the expectation slide now? Have I done the right thing?
I believe we are, yep.
Good. So I always like to go in with expectations. As I said, I'm excited as a scientist when my expectations are violated by the world, because then I have the potential to learn something new. And I find it's really useful to write down what I expect to happen, because it's really easy for us to fool ourselves. There's a good little book called Everything is Obvious Once You Know the Answer, which is written by a psychologist who has looked at how people retrofit their accounts of data after they've seen the data. And we do this seamlessly and naturally. We make up stories about how it all makes sense after we've seen the data. And I think it's useful and educational for us to make a written commitment to what we believe before we see the data, so that we are more aware of how the data has changed our beliefs. And if the data never changes our beliefs, we're probably doing it wrong. So what I expected is that we would see mostly Windows in this population of survey respondents, because we're a Perl and Windows company, and Linux comes with Perl, so why use ours, even though ours is better, because it's more secure and more up-to-date in general than what you'll find on a Linux distribution. I expected older versions would predominate. We would basically see a downward slope toward newer versions, because my thinking at the time was that Perl was primarily used by legacy projects, and people weren't starting new projects in recent versions of Perl. I also, for the same reason, expected that we would see many more older or more experienced Perl programmers than new, because we were being told that Perl was just not something that new developers were coming to and saying, I want to learn this language. Expected that the software or IT industry would dominate because it's a programming language, which is used by programmers and not non-programmers, which doesn't actually turn out to be entirely the case. And I also expected that it would be mostly web-related use, because famously Perl is the duct tape of the internet. And I had used it most heavily in web contexts, although I used it as an embedded scripted language in a large genomics data analysis package too. So all these beliefs were what I had before I looked at the data, and all of them turned out to be a little naive, which sounds so much better than wrong. So what we found was that there was a preponderance of Windows in the respondents, but a huge amount of Linux. And I do think this speaks to the value that the ActiveState distribution, ActivePerl, offers in terms of a turnkey experience with the latest version. The latest version of Perl is always available, and with the latest versions of OpenSSL in particular, and some other critical libraries. So we are giving people a better version of Perl than you're likely to find on your out-of-the-box Linux distribution. So that was our first little bit of surprise. The bigger thing was this distribution of what versions of Perl 5 people were using, and this is the industrial versus the commercial users broken out, or industrial versus individual users broken out. But you can see that the curve is not remotely monotonically decreasing. There is a dip in the middle, and then a steady, almost exponential rise in the later versions in terms of adoption, which was really surprising. These are our Perl Community Edition and Business Edition users that would be in this survey. So they would be typically fairly small Perl installs in a business. And you can also see that the low point in version use is Perl 5.12, which was released in 2010, and that coincided with the end of two very large gaps, or one very large gap with a release in the middle, in the Perl 5 release schedule. So there's the story that this tells really does leap out of the data, that when Perl no longer had a regular release cadence for new versions of the language, it started to fall out of favor. What has happened since 2010 is the Perl community has, just like clockwork, produced new major releases of Perl 5, and that has resulted in a steady increase in adoption of the language as it's pulled in features both from Perl 6 and from other scripting languages. The Perl community, the motto of the Perl community is there's more than one way to do it. And they have been quite aggressive about applying that motto to adoption of new features from other languages. Perl has always had an extremely pragmatic attitude toward problem solving, and the Perl 5 community has just been very good about asking, well, what are the problems people are having? What are the best solutions out there? How can we incorporate them into Perl? It's a different philosophy than, say, a language like Haskell, which has a different focus, where for the Haskell community, functional purity is the thing that matters overall, and that solves a bunch of problems for a bunch of people. Perl is about having a wide range of pragmatic solutions available to developers who want to do a diversity of things. And the other thing you can see on this graph, it's a little bit complicated, but up at the top, I have there's a line showing what percentage of developers have different range of experience, and you'll see that 35% of commercial developers and 53% of individual developers have less than 4 years experience in Perl. And that time period roughly coincides with the time period where the regular release cadence started. So, as well as higher adoption rates for later versions of the language as it's been released more frequently, we have seen a very significant growth rate in the number of developers coming to the language over the last few years. And that speaks extraordinarily well of the Perl community and the longevity of the language, because it's attracting new people. That's the critical thing for any programming language, that new developers come to it because it solves the problems that they actually have. And this is the graph basically that turned me on my head with regard to Perl, seeing how effective the community is being at producing regular releases. And it's important to remember these regular releases include security updates as well as feature updates. So in Active Perl, on top of that, we have a quarterly release cadence for our enterprise customers, so that we release even more frequently if a new version of OpenSSL comes out or if there are other security-related issues, so that we can provide even better support for the language than you would get from the community. The other data to look at is our enterprise customers, who are larger organizations, and there we are, who typically have Perl installed throughout their enterprise. So these will be on a very large number of machines in a particular region, like maybe throughout all of North America, say. Here you can see the conservatism of the large enterprise at play, which is not a bad thing at all. If you have working code and you have a language that serves your need, why not stick with it, other than the fact that you need regular updates for security. So we do have about 20% of our customers who are still running, our enterprise customers, who are still running Perl 5.8, because it solves their problem, and ActiveState can provide a secure version of it. We see a bit of the same dip in the Perl 5.10, Perl 5.12 timescale that we see in the Business Edition and Community Edition customers, and then a very sharp rise over the next few years. In fact, our most popular version is Perl 5.16, with about 30% of installs overall in the large enterprises. And then unsurprisingly, there's quite a sharp decline in the newer versions, simply because the enterprise upgrade cadence for a major piece of infrastructure like a programming language is considerably slower than it would be for a smaller organization. And that's an entirely sensible approach for large organizations. You don't want your bank upgrading the Perl install every year or 6 months if they don't have to, if they can get a secure version. So the story on Perl is completely different from what I was expecting when we set out to generate these survey data. It is being, recent versions basically are being used much more frequently than older versions, and the development community is much younger, much fresher than to the language than I was expecting. And I know, Karen, you've been covering technology for a long time. Have you seen anything like this in other areas of technology, or is this unique to Perl, that we've had this long hiatus and then suddenly a rebirth of the language?
I really haven't seen anything. I mean, usually once a technology dies, it's just sort of put off to pasture and put into that technology graveyard. So this is very interesting, and I guess it really speaks volumes about the benefits as well as the ease of use. I mean, I think it's not as, there's always a new language that's popping up, and there's always sort of like the language du jour, but it's sensible, it's easy to learn. There's so much out there already. I mean, you don't have to start from scratch. So I think, just in this case, the length of its duration may have to do with the fact that it was very easy to see it come back again.
Yeah, and that is one thing that certainly brings people back to the language to the language for the first time, is the Comprehensive Perl Archive Network, CPAN, has 175,000 different modules in it.
That's a lot.
That solve every imaginable problem. For reasons that I no longer remember, I did some numerical coding in Perl in the early 2000s. And I wanted an ODE solver, an ordinary differential equation solver in Perl, and I found one on CPAN, which is not really what the language is optimized for, but it did the job, and I didn't have to write the code from scratch. And that's really something that makes Perl a very attractive choice for a lot of enterprise use cases. And
this definitely a time saver.
Yeah. Yeah, and Perl skills as well are remarkably available. I mean, we have, for developers my age, practically everybody knew some Perl. And now we're seeing younger developers coming to the language as well. So you can get quite powerful languages, C++, for example, where it is extremely difficult to hire first-class talent because of the deep complexity of the language. Whereas Perl, although it is complex and powerful, is accessible enough that the developer pool is quite broad, which again makes it a good choice for the enterprise.
Interesting. I just wrote a story about makerspaces, which are these, sort of like playpens for kids K to 12, and they are actually teaching them coding, and they are teaching them Perl, which is
cool.
I was very surprised, but I think it's because of that ease of use. So when you can teach, a kid who's in high school or junior high, it's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely, and that speaks to the accessibility, and the module sets are such that with relatively few lines of code, you can do some pretty powerful and amazing things, which excites kids. I was involved in high school robotics for some years, a few years ago. And it really was amazing to see what the kids are capable of learning when you hand them the right tools. And Perl is definitely one of the right tools in that regard. So what we saw when we asked what people were using it for, 30-40% did use it in software and IT. But it turns out that Perl has spread itself across the world and industries to solve problems in telecommunications and semiconductors in particular, as well as finance, healthcare. We had one respondent tell us that these are all industrial uses. So we had one of the 99 respondents tell us that they used Perl for beer. Not totally sure what that means, but I think it's a good thing. So we are seeing that Perl is being adopted, or has been adopted, outside of the core IT use that was its traditional home. And one of the things we do see, because we sell ActiveTickle as well, to a tool command language, which is used very heavily in semiconductor design in particular, that there is a deep need for powerful scripting languages to drive some of the design tools that make our modern electronics. And Perl could well be being used in some of those areas in the semiconductor space. So it isn't just for geeks anymore, nor is it just for the web, which was probably my biggest shock in all this, being a naive person, that web use of Perl is not quite a footnote, but it's not anything like the universal application that it once was. We see a huge amount of use for general scripting and data transformation in particular, that people, the typical use case for Perl in the enterprise, in the small enterprise especially, is to pull some data out of a database, to process it somehow, and to either stick it back into a database or stick it into a report or stick it into a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet or any of the other applications that Perl has native interfaces for. So you can just automate that part of your business workflow. It's also interesting that the percentage of legacy uses of Perl in our survey responses were just extremely small. That people, there is a lot of Perl legacy code out there, no question, but that people are not just letting that code sit there. They're continuing to use it. They're continuing to update it. They're not thinking of it as legacy code. They're thinking of it as current code that they're still working on, even though it may be on an older version of Perl. And I created some word clouds to get a sense of what individuals and enterprises are using it for, and you can see how text especially and data jump out. As I said earlier, the large scale text processing is a really obvious use case for Perl in the enterprise, and there's just a huge amount of stuff that enterprises need in this space, particularly as we move into the world of ubiquitous big data. We need ways to be able to stream and process this stuff efficiently, and Perl makes that extraordinarily easy.
There's some really neat words in here too. I mean, I see, is that informatics up there?
Bioinformatics, yes.
Yeah, that's amazing. I wonder what they were
Perl
doing.
Perl was a major language in bioinformatics, and it's actually funny because there's actually a string processing use for Perl in bioinformatics, because if you look at DNA sequences, they're strings of letters. So when you start developing matching algorithms, alignment algorithms, difference algorithms, looking at the genome, Perl is a very natural language to use because of its text processing capability.
I never would have known that. I'm surprised I didn't know that. That's pretty neat.
It is one of these things where textual representation of information is everywhere. And as soon as you have some information that's textual rather than numeric or graphical, Perl becomes an incredibly natural language to process it with. And it also is heavy in automation. I don't know if we can see that quite as much in the individual uses, but I think if we go to the corporate uses, automation leaps out. Scripts, data processing, a little bit of web, files, reporting. So we do see a lot, and we use it in-house at ActiveState to automate internal tasks. It's a very natural tool. If you need a job that's run, once a week, once a day, whatever, to take some data, to transform it, to export it into likely a more human-readable format, Perl is just the natural tool to use. And data analysis of one kind or another. Easy is a word that comes up a lot in the responses. Perl used to have this reputation for being a write-only language, as it was said. That hasn't been the case for a long, long time. And there is an entire movement within the Perl community, which must be close to a decade old now, called Modern Perl, which brought to Perl a set of disciplines around the way the language was used and the way applications are tested as well. It's a very test-driven development type of community that has really improved the average quality of Perl code across the board. That the Perl community as a whole has embraced the disciplines of modern Perl and recognized that, as I said about chainsaws, like any tool, you can use it badly. And so in the modern Perl movement, we've seen the development of a set of disciplines for using it well. And that has made the language easy for a vast number of people, even outside of the development community. When we ask why Active Perl, which as an enterprise software company, we're interested in knowing, commercial support, easy again, becomes big. We are easy to install, but we also do supply commercial support. We supply indemnification. We're a well-known brand. ActiveState is almost 20 years old, which is a pretty remarkable thing for a .com era company. And we support Windows as well. That's for individuals. For corporations, Windows still looms large because Windows is a very important part of the enterprise ecosystem. The fact that we're one company you can go to for support with an excellent record and reputation that we've earned over the years by being there to support and upgrade enterprise Perl. These are the sorts of things that people come to ActiveState for, and as I said, indemnification as well. There's always that issue around open source software that you want some assurance that you're dealing with stuff which is licensed appropriately and doesn't have encumbrances that might impact your enterprise. And that's part of the peace of mind that ActiveState gives our customers. So this is where I landed on the Perl Paradox, that we were in this situation where, from ActiveState's point of view, everybody was using Perl, but nobody was talking about it. And it really was the case that it's actually more than 3 to 5 years ago, it's probably 7 years ago, there was a lull in Perl adoption. We had a little middle-age type period. And then with the yearly release cadence, the improved features, the ongoing upgrades to security, turned that around, and people have come back to Perl. But it remains this unobtrusive thing. It's just there. It is not something that anybody goes to an analyst about in particular, because people go to analysts to ask questions like, what programming language should I use for this project? And for a significant range of use cases, Perl is just such an obvious choice that people go ahead and use it. They know that they can get developers who will understand the language, so there's very little risk, sort of demographic risk around choosing it. It's not like choosing a language which is brand new, where we don't know whether it will take off or not. Perl, we know, is going to be with us for a long time, and we'll have a large pool of developers for a long time. So it's a good language for enterprises to choose for any project which is going to be part of their business for a long time. And it's an easy language to use, and particularly with CPAN, the odds are that somebody has already written a big chunk of the code that you need for your enterprise use case. So fundamentally, we don't talk about easy. We don't agonize over decisions around using Perl. We don't go to analysts and say, should I use Perl for this? Because it's such an obvious choice for the cases where it's a good solution. And that's a broad range of cases for data transformation in particular. Data processing, text processing. There are just a whole lot of things where there are other languages you could use, no question, but the tools that Perl brings to the table make it sufficiently obvious that it's just a very low-risk decision to take. So this is what I think of as the era that we're in now, is the Perl Renaissance, where we have a language which is fast, powerful, flexible, easy to use, has this ridiculously comprehensive network of modules available, a large, vibrant, and inclusive community. Some language communities are a little insular. Perl's is just welcoming, open, encouraging, and supportive, and overall, just a huge vitality to the language and the community that provides support for anyone coming to it. And on top of that, commercial support for the language through ActiveState. So there is very little reason not to consider Perl seriously for any major enterprise IT project. And that is where we landed on the question. So what we sell, as I mentioned along the way, we do have a business edition, which is Perl on Windows or OS X or Linux for all Perl 5 versions back to 5.8. That's intended for use on a single machine. Those are basically individual licenses for small and medium businesses. And but we also, for larger enterprises who need Perl everywhere throughout the business, have our Active Perl Enterprise Edition, which is a site licensed or site-wide installation with enterprise-grade support, indemnification for IP issues, and also access to versions on what we call the big iron platforms, the AIX, the HPUX, the Solarises of the world, and are intended for a larger installation base. One of the things that you get from ActiveState is the fact that we will ship you the same version of Perl. If you want Perl, 5.10.3 on Windows, Linux, and AIX, you'll get exactly the same bits. I mean, there'll be different binaries, obviously, but they'll be built from the same source using the same processes, which supports cross-platform use cases. You can test reliably on one machine, deploy on another, and have a very high probability of getting the same behavior on both. So it's a nice reassurance for an enterprise that wants the same version throughout, but has heterogeneous hardware. And then beyond that, we have an OEM edition of Active Perl that lets companies redistribute it with their products and takes care of all the licensing issues that go along with that. And Perl, my own personal use of Perl back in the day was using it as an embedded language in a larger application on Windows, and it's a nice, powerful scripting language in an application. If people want to learn more, this is where we are, and Solutions at ActiveState will connect you to our support people to talk about what Perl can do in particular use cases. Now, I do understand we've been open to questions from the audience, and we have some time.
Yes, we do. We have about 10 minutes, so it's wonderful. And Tom, great information in there. It is time for our Q&A. So I've been watching, and there have been some wonderful questions coming in. But if you haven't asked your question, it's time for you, the listener, to ask any you may have by using that question box on the left side of the screen. So like I said, we've had a ton coming in. Why don't we get started with this first one? And this one comes from John. So John would like to know, what are some of the most common use cases you see for Perl?
It's the enterprise backroom jobs is what I think of. An enterprise backroom automation, call it that, where enterprises are processing large amounts of data on a daily basis on some kind of basically a batch type schedule, where every hour, every day, or even every week, a process kicks off on 1,000 servers, say, and processes a bunch of data out of a database that would, take the data, collate it, generate summary reports, those sorts of things. So we see that's sort of our largest use case. And then in the smaller enterprises, it's the same thing but on a smaller scale, where it's pulling data out of the database, doing a bunch of processing on it, putting it back in the database, and or generating a report for human consumption. those are the dominant cases. Data transformation, particularly transformation of textual data, is the big use case. But there's a lot of numerical processing as well because it's used in financial services too.
Okay. Let's see, more questions. So why don't we grab this one? And this one comes from Frank. Frank says, can you describe the differences between your business and enterprise editions? Why would a company go with one over the other?
Yeah, Business Edition is a license to run Active Perl on a single server, single machine. So it is typically suitable for a smaller enterprise that might only have one, might have 3, 4, 5 machines that it needs to run Active Perl on, whereas the Enterprise Edition is a wide open site license and also supports a wider range of machines. So the Business Edition is only available on Mac, Linux, and Windows, whereas the Enterprise Edition is available on AIX, HPUX, and Solaris as well.
Okay, let's see, more questions. This one actually comes from Jen. So Jen says, how do you handle open source licensing?
Carefully. Perl itself is released under the artistic license, or the Perl license, which does permit redistribution under certain conditions. The most important condition from our point of view is that modifications to the source code do need to be made available. We do scans for licenses on the things that we ship. We're careful in terms of what licenses we allow into the final distribution, but fundamentally we are making sure that Active Perl contains open source licenses that are friendly to proprietary use cases. That's probably the best way to put it.
Okay, let's see. So this comes from Chris, and let's see. So he says, why do you think Perl use is increasing for younger developers? Are they simply inheriting a lot of legacy projects, or is it something else?
I think from the data that we're seeing, it is something else. I think that younger developers are coming to Perl because it does have powerful features. The Moose object system, for example, is just great. It's an object. Perl's old object system was kind of complicated, and I used to struggle with it back in the day. Whereas the Moose object system is simple, easy, powerful, and clean. And my understanding is that a lot of the Moose features were basically backported from Perl 6, which is a different language. So when you take something like that, you can when you put that in front of a developer who hasn't used Perl before and show them how Moose works, it's fun. They like it. It's powerful, it's simple, it's easy, it's expressive, it's natural. By the same token, the regular expression engine in Perl is so clean, so powerful, and so deeply integrated with the language that it is just a joy to use. And as I said earlier, it's something I always felt friction with in other languages. When I had to process a regular expression, it felt like I had to stop and think about it. And, I need this module, I need to do this, I need to do that. With Perl, it's just there as part of the language. And it's a fun experience to just be able to express yourself that directly and that powerfully as part of the language itself. And I really think that is something that is bringing younger developers or new developers to Perl, because this is what software developers love. They love to be able to express their ideas succinctly and elegantly in a programming language, and Perl provides some really great tools for doing that.
Okay, well, we have a question here from Michael now. So Michael would like to know, how do you differentiate between a programming language and a scripting language?
A scripting language is a subset of programming languages. The programming languages as a whole include compiled languages, where you take the text and run it through a compiler that produces a binary file which is executable. In a scripting language, typically, you have an interpreter for the language that reads the text of the script and executes it inside the interpreter. So it's a funny distinction that has come about through historical contingency, I guess, in one sense. Most scripting languages these days, including Perl, have a compilation step in the interpreter, but it's done at runtime rather than earlier. So I don't know whether that answers the question. It's a kind of a technical distinction, but it does have some real-world consequences, because a compiled language, you can take the program, compile it, and distribute it independently of everything else. Whereas with an interpreted language, you always have to ship the interpreter along with the application.
Okay. We're actually coming to the top of the hour, so if it's okay, we'll ask one more question and we'll let everyone get back to their day.
Sure thing.
So this comes from James. So James says, just out of curiosity, do you have any idea what percentage of Perl users use ActiveState versus others?
It's not clear, actually. It's a difficult number to get hold of. We have hundreds of thousands of downloads of Active Perl per month. I can say that. And that's not a small fraction of the overall number of Perl installs that are going on per month. So I expect that we are comfortably into the tens of percent of Perl use worldwide.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Excellent presentation. Really, really wonderful. We were not able to get to every question, so apology. If we didn't get your question, we will absolutely make sure that you get an answer. And that said, again, thank you so much, Tom. Wonderful presentation, but I'm afraid we're out of time.
Thank you, Karen.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you to everyone for joining us today for our special webcast, The Perl Paradox. I'm Karen Bannon, and on behalf of Tom Radcliffe, ActiveState, and everyone at the eMedia family of publications, thank you for your time and have a great day.